What would you do if your lawyer was an iconic actor, known for playing tough guys, but you needed him to deliver in the courtroom? The courtroom was unusually silent. The air hung heavy with anticipation, each person waiting for the opening statements to begin. The judge, an imposing figure with an air of no-nonsense authority, glanced around the room, clearly evaluating each person in the proceedings. His eyes paused on the defendant's side, where a lone figure sat at the defense table. Clint Eastwood. Yes, the Clint Eastwood, the one and only man who had spent decades playing grizzled lawmen and cold-eyed detectives on the big screen. The man who was known for being a tough guy, a fighter, the kind of person you'd expect to see in a dusty western town or a high-stakes action film, not sitting across from a judge in a real courtroom. The courtroom murmured with a quiet buzz. Whispers spread like wildfire through the room. Is he really here as a lawyer? Did someone hire him for this case? What is he doing in this courtroom? The judge, Judge Johnson, couldn't help but raise an eyebrow as he studied Clint. He'd been a judge for over 30 years, and never in all his years on the bench had he seen a celebrity step into his courtroom. Let alone someone as famous as Clint Eastwood. The last time he'd seen Clint on screen, he had been shooting up bad guys in a gritty action flick. The idea of this man standing here as the lawyer defending a case felt like something out of a movie script, a script he wasn't sure he wanted to be a part of. Clint sat casually, his hands folded in front of him, exuding an air of effortless confidence. He wasn't wearing a flashy suit or putting on any of the charisma he was known for in movies. He looked every bit the professional, dressed in a simple black suit, white shirt, and a tie that was just a little too loosely knotted, giving off the impression that he wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was, frankly, unnerving. Judge Johnson adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. His voice echoed through the room, deep and authoritative. Mr. Eastwood, I trust you are familiar with the rules of this courtroom? Clint's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. He looked over at the judge, then back at the jury, and finally, he stood up. Yes, Your Honor. I've watched enough courtroom dramas to get the gist of it, he said with a grin that somehow softened the tense atmosphere in the room. A couple of the jury members chuckled lightly, clearly trying to stifle their amusement. But Judge Johnson wasn't amused. He had to keep things professional. Mr. Eastwood, the judge began, his voice stern, this is not a film set, and this is not a time for jokes. I expect professionalism in this courtroom. Now, do you have your opening statement ready? The chuckles in the room died down. Clint straightened his back and nodded, his playful demeanor quickly shifting to something more serious. Yes, Your Honor. I do. The courtroom fell silent as Clint stepped forward. For a moment, it felt like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the great Clint Eastwood to speak. Would he be just another actor playing at being a lawyer? Or was there something deeper beneath the surface? Something the judge and jury would soon learn. I don't want to waste anyone's time today, Clint began, his voice calm but firm. I know you all have a job to do, and I know that's why we're all here. But there's something you should know, about my client, and about the case we're about to present. He paused for effect, making sure every eye in the room was on him. This case isn't just about legal jargon or technicalities. It's about a person. A real person, who's been unfairly accused. And I'll prove that. I don't have flashy arguments or a rehearsed speech. What I have is the truth. And, trust me, the truth is something you can't argue with. A hush fell over the room. The jury leaned in, their curiosity piqued by Clint's direct approach. His words carried a weight that somehow made the courtroom feel less like a cold, impersonal legal battle and more like a scene out of one of his movies, except this time, the stakes were real. Judge Johnson, his brow furrowed in skepticism, glanced at Clint, then the jury, then back at Clint. There was no denying the presence the actor-turned-lawyer had in the room. And despite himself, Johnson found a flicker of respect for Clint's straightforwardness. But the judge wasn't going to let this moment slip without maintaining control. "I'll reserve judgment until I see the evidence, Mr. Eastwood," Judge Johnson said, his voice clipped. "But I expect you to adhere to the decorum of this courtroom, or I will hold you in contempt." Clint nodded, his expression serious now, the humor of a moment ago completely gone. "You'll get nothing less, Your Honor," he said, and then turned to face the jury, making eye contact with each of them, one by one. There was something captivating about Clint's demeanor. It was calm, collected, and yet there was a certain intensity in his eyes, something more than just the actor's persona. It was clear that Clint had been in high-pressure situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a role. This was real life. And for the first time in the proceedings, Judge Johnson felt a flicker of doubt about his initial assessment. Maybe Clint Eastwood wasn't just playing a part. Maybe he had something more to offer this courtroom than anyone had expected. As Clint took his seat again, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to his client, a middle-aged man in a suit who had been sitting quietly, his face filled with uncertainty. The man seemed to draw a breath of relief as Clint settled back in his chair, his gaze never wavering from the task at hand. The tension in the room seemed to ease just a little, but it was clear that the battle was only just beginning. The stakes were high, and Clint Eastwood had just made it very clear that he wasn't going to back down. "Proceed, Mr. Eastwood," the judge said, his tone still firm, but there was an edge of curiosity now. "You may call your first witness." The game was on. As the defense team prepared for the first witness, Clint Eastwood remained calm and collected, his eyes scanning the courtroom, taking in the faces of the jury, the judge, and the opposition. This wasn't a movie. This was a fight for justice. And Clint Eastwood had just made his entrance. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood had always been a man of few words. That was part of the reason why people adored him on screen. He was the quiet, mysterious hero, the one whose actions spoke louder than words ever could. But few knew the man behind the iconic squint, the grizzled voice, and the hard-edged persona. Few knew that the man who had made a career out of playing tough guys had once been someone who had to fight not just on screen, but in real life as well. His journey into the legal world hadn't been a traditional one, and it certainly hadn't been easy. Born in San Francisco and raised in the East Bay, Clint Eastwood had come from humble beginnings. He wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and his family wasn't wealthy. His father was a steelworker, and his mother worked as a clerk in a local store. From an early age, Clint learned the value of hard work. He had to fight for what he wanted, whether it was respect, success, or just a place at the table. Growing up, Clint was no stranger to adversity. He wasn't a particularly stellar student, but what he lacked in academic prowess, he made up for with an undeniable drive. He had a quiet resilience that most people didn't see. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. That's how he got his first break in Hollywood. A casting director spotted him in a local cafe, overhearing him talking about his passion for film and storytelling. The director saw something in him, something raw and powerful, and decided to offer him a role in a small Western film. That was the beginning of it all. Clint rose to fame quickly, becoming a symbol of the rugged, silent hero who did things his way. But while his fame grew, so did his dissatisfaction with the type of roles he was offered. He wanted more than just being the tough guy with a gun. He wanted to challenge himself, to push beyond the boundaries of his image. That's when Clint decided to switch gears. After years of playing tough guys on screen, Clint wanted to be involved in something more real, something that could make a tangible difference. He'd always been interested in justice and fairness, having seen too many people wronged in the world. It was no surprise when he decided to study law in his late 40s, after stepping back from Hollywood's bright lights. He enrolled at a local law school and, much to the surprise of many, excelled. He wasn't interested in becoming a courtroom legend, nor did he seek fame for being a lawyer. He wanted to understand the inner workings of the law, to help people who needed it most. It wasn't an easy path. While Clint had mastered the art of commanding a room with a stare or a line, he found the technicalities of law and the subtleties of courtroom procedure challenging. But his determination paid off. Clint didn't just want to act as a lawyer, he wanted to be a good one. He spent hours reading case law, learning about legal precedents, and honing his skills. In every sense, Clint Eastwood was reinventing himself. But his transition wasn't without skepticism. Most of his colleagues in the legal world didn't take him seriously. After all, what did an actor know about law? But Clint didn't mind the doubts. He had been underestimated before, and every time, he had proved everyone wrong. As Clint prepared for his first big case in the courtroom, his thoughts wandered back to those early days, when he had been an unknown, when he had fought for his place in the world. He had faced an uphill battle before, and now, here he was again, fighting for justice, not on a movie set, but in a real courtroom. This was his test. Sitting at the defense table now, Clint was a far cry from the famous gunslinger who had captured audiences with his stoic presence. He was a lawyer, a man with a deep respect for the law and a fierce desire to make a difference. As the jury filed in, Clint straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and prepared to begin. The case he was defending was one that had caught the public's attention. His client, Adam Miller, was accused of embezzling millions of dollars from a major tech company. The evidence was stacked against him, but Clint believed there was more to the story. He knew that in the world of tech startups and corporate giants, things were never as simple as they appeared. People in power often played dirty, and he was convinced Adam had been framed. Clint's client was a young man in his 30s, sharp-looking with a quiet demeanor, sitting nervously at the defense table. His eyes darted around the room, but his gaze always returned to Clint with a mix of trust and fear. It was clear that Adam was overwhelmed by the situation, and Clint could understand why. Being accused of something like this could ruin a person's life in a matter of seconds. Clint had to make sure that didn't happen. Clint's reputation as an actor may have earned him a seat in the courtroom, but it was his legal expertise and sharp instincts that would win the case. As much as Judge Johnson had been skeptical, Clint knew that his quiet strength and dogged determination would eventually win the judge, and the jury, over. The courtroom had a tense energy, the kind that makes you feel like you're walking on eggshells. The jury members exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure of what to make of Clint's unconventional approach. After all, it was hard to separate Clint Eastwood the actor from Clint Eastwood the lawyer. But Clint wasn't concerned about appearances. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. His confidence wasn't derived from the fame he had accumulated over the years. It came from the countless hours he had put into studying the law, and his unwavering belief in his client's innocence. Judge Johnson, still eyeing Clint with suspicion, cleared his throat and addressed the room. "Mr. Eastwood, I hope you're prepared to present your case in a manner befitting this courtroom. I don't care for theatrics." Clint gave a small, knowing smile, his eyes narrowing slightly. "No theatrics, Your Honor. Just the truth." With that, Clint leaned back in his chair and looked at the prosecutor, who was preparing to present their case. The battle was just beginning, and Clint Eastwood wasn't about to back down. The courtroom was alive with tension. Judge Johnson had already warned Clint Eastwood not to treat this like one of his old Western films, and now, Clint was determined to prove that he wasn't here for theatrics, but for justice. His calm demeanor was the perfect contrast to the rising chaos around him, as the prosecution prepared to lay out a case that, on the surface, seemed damning. Across from Clint sat the prosecutor, Michael Reynolds, a man with a reputation for being ruthless in the courtroom. He was young, sharp, and ambitious, everything Clint was not. Reynolds had a clean-cut, polished look, with neatly combed hair and a suit that screamed, "I mean business." He was the type of lawyer who thrived on pressure, who fed off the scrutiny of the jury and the judge. His strategy was simple: crush the defense with facts, and when that didn't work, make it personal. Clint wasn't intimidated. He had learned long ago that the real battle wasn't fought with facts alone. It was fought with intuition, emotion, and, most importantly, with an unwavering belief in the cause. This case was no different. His client, Adam Miller, was being accused of embezzling millions from a leading tech firm, but Clint knew there was more to the story. Much more. As the prosecution began, Michael Reynolds stood up, his voice smooth and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you will hear the story of Adam Miller, a man who betrayed the trust of his colleagues and his company. The evidence will show that Mr. Miller transferred millions of dollars from his employer into his personal accounts, hiding behind the veil of company resources. This is not a case of confusion or error. This is a deliberate act of theft." The jury's eyes were glued to Reynolds, who spoke with conviction and purpose. Clint, on the other hand, sat silently, his arms folded across his chest. He was listening, analyzing every word, every tone. He knew Reynolds was good, there was no doubt about that. But Clint wasn't here to be intimidated by rhetoric. He was here to find the truth. Reynolds continued, detailing the financial records, showing how large sums of money had been moved under Adam Miller's name. The prosecutor's voice carried over the courtroom as he laid out the damning evidence. He was methodical, pointing out discrepancies, highlighting every small detail that could paint Adam as guilty. Clint's gaze never wavered. He studied the projections on the screen, the paper trails, the digital transfers. Nothing he saw made sense. He knew the tech world well, too well. This was a fast-paced industry, where numbers could easily be manipulated, where behind-the-scenes actions could be misinterpreted, and where things were not always what they seemed. And there was something about this case that didn't add up. But Clint wasn't ready to show his hand just yet. As Reynolds finished his opening statement and sat back down, Clint stood up slowly. His movements were deliberate, controlled, everything about him seemed to convey a calm that bordered on unshakable. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Clint began, his voice gravelly but clear, "I don't plan on wasting your time with a lengthy speech or making big promises. But I do plan to prove something that the prosecution has already overlooked." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the room. "What you'll hear from the prosecution is a story, but the story they're telling isn't the whole truth." He turned toward Adam, who was sitting at the defense table, looking visibly anxious. Clint gave him a quick, reassuring glance before continuing. "We're not here to deny that money was moved or that Adam Miller worked for the company. We're here to ask the real question, why? Why would a man who had everything, his career, his future, his reputation, throw it all away for money?" Clint let the question hang in the air, watching as the jury members shifted in their seats, clearly intrigued. He wasn't giving them all the answers yet. He was just getting them to think. Getting them to doubt the simple narrative the prosecution had set up. "Adam Miller is a man of integrity," Clint continued, his voice becoming more intense. "The man you'll hear about today is not some career criminal. He's a man who got caught up in something bigger than himself, and he's paying the price for it. But I'm here to tell you, this case is more than just a ledger of stolen money. It's about a person, a man who is being painted with a brush that doesn't fit. A man who didn't have the chance to explain himself before everything was thrown into chaos." Clint sat down, his eyes never leaving the jury. His words had planted a seed of doubt in their minds. Now, the real work began. The battle would be in the details. And Clint had a lot of details to work with. The first witness for the defense was called to the stand, a young woman named Erica Johnson, a junior accountant at the tech company where Adam had worked. She was a quiet, unassuming woman, someone who had always been in the background, keeping the books and balancing the numbers. But Clint knew she had a story to tell. She had seen something that didn't sit right, and she had the courage to come forward. As Erica took the stand, Clint gave her an encouraging smile. "Erica, thank you for being here today. Could you please tell the jury about your role at the company?" Erica cleared her throat and nodded, her nervousness evident. I was responsible for managing the financial records and ensuring that all transactions were properly logged and accounted for, she said, her voice soft but clear. I worked directly under the head of accounting, and my job was to flag any discrepancies I saw. Clint leaned forward slightly, his gaze intent. And did you ever notice anything unusual with the transactions involving Mr. Miller? Erica hesitated. Yes, she said quietly. There were a few times when certain transfers didn't seem to match the usual patterns. But I wasn't the one in charge of approving those transactions, I just flagged them and sent them up the chain. The prosecutor scoffed from his seat. Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. Judge Johnson raised an eyebrow but nodded. Sustained. Let's keep this focused on the facts, Mr. Eastwood. Clint didn't miss a beat. Of course, Your Honor. Erica, were you ever able to get clarification on these irregularities? Erica nodded again, this time more confidently. Yes. I brought it up with my boss a few times. But each time, I was told not to worry about it. That it was part of a larger restructuring project. Clint's heart raced. This was it, the crack in the case that could break it wide open. If there was a larger project at play, if these discrepancies weren't as random as they seemed, then it opened the door for a whole new theory. Clint wasn't just defending Adam Miller anymore, he was starting to uncover a deeper conspiracy. The room grew silent as Clint leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the possibilities. The pieces were falling into place, but he still had a long way to go. This was only the beginning. The courtroom buzzed with a mixture of anticipation and skepticism. Clint Eastwood had made his move, planting the seeds of doubt with Erica's testimony, and now it was time to navigate the stormy waters ahead. The prosecution had been sharp, relentless, but Clint was no rookie in the art of battle. He had been through his share of intense moments, whether on a film set or in his own life, and now, he was in the midst of a legal showdown that felt like something straight out of the movies. The journey ahead would not be easy. He could sense the tide was shifting, but he knew that getting the jury to believe in Adam Miller's innocence wouldn't be a simple task. There were still many unanswered questions, and the defense had to dig deeper. But Clint felt the tension in his bones, the kind of tension that only comes when you're on the edge of something big. The next step in Clint's strategy was to focus on the technology aspect of the case. Adam Miller had worked in a fast-paced environment, dealing with millions of dollars in transactions that were often handled with sophisticated software. If Clint could unravel the technical side of things, he might be able to show that Adam was just a pawn in a much larger game. Adam sat beside Clint, looking more nervous than ever. The weight of the accusations against him was heavy, and Clint could see the fear in his eyes. Adam was beginning to realize that this was no longer just a case of proving innocence, it was a battle against powerful people who had far more resources than one man could hope to fight. Clint turned to Adam, giving him a reassuring nod. We're not giving up. This isn't over yet. Adam looked at Clint, searching for the strength that his lawyer seemed to carry so effortlessly. What if it's too late? What if I can't clear my name? Clint paused, looking him in the eye. You've got a shot. And I'll make sure we take it. But you have to trust me. Adam swallowed hard and nodded. The next morning, Clint and his team delved into the technical aspects of the case. They called in a forensic expert who could break down the complex software systems used by the company, someone who could speak with authority on how money could be transferred electronically without anyone noticing, how one could conceal transactions beneath layers of code, and how systems could be manipulated to hide the truth. This was Clint's path forward, understanding how the tech company's operations worked and whether Adam had been framed by someone inside the company who had the knowledge and the ability to cover their tracks. Clint sat down with the expert, a middle-aged man named Richard Anderson, who was known in the field for his expertise in financial fraud within the tech industry. Richard, Clint started, can you explain to the court how this type of financial manipulation could happen? Specifically, How could someone with access to the system make it appear that Adam Miller was involved in something he wasn't? Richard adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. The system is designed to be fluid, Mr. Eastwood. Transactions move fast, especially in tech companies that handle large sums of money. It's very easy to create a false paper trail, using ghost accounts or encrypted transfers that don't show up immediately in the company's main ledger. With the right knowledge and access, it's possible to divert funds without triggering alarms. Clint nodded, absorbing the information. So, you're telling me that Adam Miller, despite being a part of this company, could have been framed without ever knowing about it? That's correct, Richard confirmed. It could have been someone with higher-level access, someone who could cover their tracks and manipulate the records. It's also possible that someone was using Adam's credentials to carry out these actions, while he had no idea. This was the breakthrough Clint had been waiting for. The pieces were starting to fit together. Clint didn't need to prove Adam's innocence right away, he needed to show the jury that there was enough doubt to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the case. Clint sat with his team, looking over the evidence and discussing strategy. They were in uncharted territory. The jury was still on edge, still skeptical, and the prosecution wasn't going to let up. The stakes were higher than ever. But Clint's resolve was stronger than it had ever been. He had one shot to show the jury that there was more to the story than what they had heard so far. The day of the next hearing, Clint entered the courtroom with renewed purpose. As he walked past the row of spectators and journalists, he saw the familiar faces of people who only knew him as the actor, the man who had made movies, not the lawyer who was now making a stand in real life. The weight of the situation pressed on him, but he didn't show it. His poker face, something he'd perfected over the years in front of cameras, was now a mask of focus and determination. Judge Johnson looked up as Clint took his seat, and for the first time, the judge's gaze softened slightly. Clint had been nothing but professional and methodical in his approach, and it hadn't gone unnoticed. Clint stood up to begin his cross-examination of the prosecution's star witness, a man named Gregory Langston, the head of security at the tech company. Langston was one of the prosecution's strongest witnesses, claiming that he had witnessed Adam Miller transfer funds through unauthorized channels. Clint knew this was where the battle would intensify. If he could break down Langston's testimony, he could tear apart the prosecution's case. He started by focusing on one critical detail, how Langston had known about Adam's involvement in the transfer. Mr. Langston, Clint began, you're telling us that you saw Mr. Miller personally initiate a transfer of funds, is that correct? Langston nodded, his face rigid. Yes. I witnessed him access the system during a security check. The logs show that he transferred a significant amount of money. Clint raised an eyebrow. And this happened at night, correct? When everyone else was gone. Langston hesitated for a moment before answering. Yes, but... Clint interrupted smoothly. But it wasn't Mr. Miller who initiated the transfer, was it, Mr. Langston? In fact, it was someone using his credentials. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who had the knowledge to cover their tracks and manipulate the system to make it look like Mr. Miller was responsible. Langston's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Clint could see the uncertainty in his eyes. You're not sure, are you, Mr. Langston? You saw something, but it didn't add up. You didn't have the full picture. Clint let the words linger in the air, the tension palpable. The jury was watching intently, and Clint could see the cracks starting to appear in Langston's confidence. Clint wasn't just questioning the facts, he was questioning the very foundation of the prosecution's case. As Langston stammered a response, Clint knew that the tide was beginning to turn. The journey was far from over, but Clint Eastwood was starting to gain the upper hand. The courtroom was thick with suspense. It had been a long and exhausting week of testimony, but Clint Eastwood wasn't about to let the defense falter now. The stakes had never been higher, Adam Miller's future hung in the balance, and Clint had committed to seeing this through. The defense had made its mark with technical testimony, questioning motives, and casting doubt, but now, Clint was preparing to push the case to its most emotional point. Clint's strategy had always been one of emotional resonance. While others might rely solely on facts and figures, Clint understood something the prosecution didn't: the power of empathy. Today, Clint would show the jury the person behind the numbers. He would humanize Adam Miller, pulling back the curtain on the man accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit. The day's session began, and the courtroom was eerily quiet. Clint stood as Adam was called to the stand. Adam had always been quiet, reserved, and hesitant to speak up. But today, something was different. Clint could feel it. Adam's fear was still there, but it was tempered by a growing sense of resolve. He was finally ready to fight for his innocence. Clint approached Adam's seat and gave him a small nod. "Adam, I want you to take your time today. This is your chance to speak, to let the jury know who you really are." Adam nodded back, his hands shaking slightly. Clint could see the anxiety in his eyes, but he also saw a flicker of hope. It was as if the weight of the case had finally begun to sink in, and Adam knew that this was his only opportunity to be heard. "Mr. Miller," Clint began, turning to address the jury, "can you tell the jury about your life before all of this? About who you are and what you've worked for?" Adam took a deep breath and began, his voice shaky at first. "I've always worked hard. I came from a small town. My family didn't have a lot of money. I had to earn everything I had, and I did it the right way. I studied hard, got good grades, and eventually landed a job at one of the most respected tech companies in the country." Adam paused, his eyes wandering as though he were recalling memories that had been locked away. "When I got hired, I was proud. I thought I was building something with my life, making a difference. I worked long hours, sometimes weekends. I wasn't just doing it for the paycheck, I was doing it because I believed in the company, in what we were creating. I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself." Clint watched as Adam's words began to pull at the heartstrings of the jury. The defense was no longer just about facts and figures, it was about the emotional weight of Adam's journey. "Can you explain to the jury how you felt when these accusations were first made against you?" Clint asked, his voice softening. Adam's eyes glistened, and for the first time in the trial, Clint saw vulnerability in his client. I was in shock. I couldn't believe it. I never did anything wrong. I never stole from anyone. I don't even know how this happened. All I know is that one day, I woke up, and everything I had worked for was gone. My reputation, my career, everything I had built, just torn down." Clint let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting Adam's words sink in. This wasn't a man who was cold or indifferent. This was a man who had been shattered by the accusations against him, someone who had worked his whole life to get to this point only to find it all unraveling. "Do you believe that you were framed, Adam?" Clint asked, his voice steady. Adam looked down for a moment, then nodded, his voice breaking. "Yes. I don't know how, I don't know who, but I know I didn't do this." Clint placed a hand on Adam's shoulder, offering him a moment of comfort. The jury was listening now, their eyes softened by Adam's emotional testimony. Clint had played his hand perfectly. Now, Adam's humanity was out in the open. He wasn't just a name on a case file, he was a person, a man who had dedicated his life to something only to have it torn apart. But Clint wasn't finished yet. He needed to push further, to find the one key element that would tie the emotional weight of Adam's words to the growing uncertainty in the case. "Adam, I want to take you back to that night. The night when these funds were supposedly transferred under your name. What do you remember about that night?" Clint asked. Adam swallowed hard. He was visibly struggling, the memory still haunting him. "I was working late that night, yes. But I wasn't doing anything that could be considered wrong. I was working on a project, something that could have been the future of the company. But I never did anything with the finances. I didn't even have access to those accounts directly. I couldn't have done it. Adam's voice wavered, but there was a firmness in it, a belief that Clint knew was genuine. The jury was leaning forward now, absorbed in Adam's testimony. Clint paused for a moment before speaking again. You mentioned that you were working on a big project that night. Do you think someone might have taken advantage of your absence, your focus on that project, and used your credentials to cover their own tracks? Adam nodded slowly, his face tense with the memory. I do. It's the only thing that makes sense. I think someone used my name, my access, to make it look like I was the one behind it. I didn't see it coming. But now, I think I've been made a scapegoat. Clint turned to the jury, his voice gaining strength. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Adam Miller is a man who has been wronged. He is a man who has built his career from the ground up, who dedicated himself to a company, to a cause he believed in. He is not a criminal. He is not a thief. He is a victim of circumstances that he could never have predicted, and today, you have the power to see him for who he truly is. Clint returned his focus to Adam. Thank you, Adam. You've shown great courage today. Adam gave a small nod, his eyes brimming with emotion. The jury was silent, their expressions hard to read. But Clint could feel it. The tide had shifted. He had done more than question facts and figures, he had humanized Adam. He had given the jury a reason to believe that Adam Miller was a person who deserved justice, not a scapegoat. As the court session ended for the day, Clint left the courtroom with a sense of accomplishment. He had done his part. The case was far from over, but for the first time since the trial had begun, he felt a sense of hope. The emotional breakthrough had made the case personal for the jury, it wasn't just about embezzlement anymore. It was about justice. But as Clint walked out of the courthouse, he couldn't help but feel that the biggest twist was yet to come. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation. The emotional weight of Adam's testimony had left a lasting impact on everyone present. As Clint walked back to his seat, he could feel the subtle shift in the air. The jury's eyes seemed less judgmental, more open. The tension in the room was palpable. It felt as if, for the first time, the case was beginning to tip in their favor. But Clint knew better than to get complacent. The journey was far from over. There was still a major hurdle ahead, a final confrontation with the prosecution, and a twist that he knew was lurking just beneath the surface. Clint knew that he had to keep the momentum going. He couldn't let the jury rest on the emotional appeal alone. The truth had to be exposed, but it wasn't going to be easy. As much as Clint had humanized Adam, the prosecution still had a powerful case based on circumstantial evidence and the weight of their witness testimonies. The next morning, as Clint sat with his team going over their strategy, his lead investigator, Sarah Green, entered the room with a stack of files. Her face was tense, but Clint could see the spark of something in her eyes. Something important. Clint, Sarah said as she dropped the files onto the table, I've been digging deeper into the company's network. And I think I've found something that could change everything. Clint leaned forward, his interest piqued. What is it? Sarah flipped open the top file and slid it across the table to Clint. We've been focusing on the financial aspect, but what I found was even more crucial, something hidden in the company's internal email system. Someone with access to Adam's emails and login credentials had been communicating with an unknown third party. And here's the kicker, this communication started long before the incident that led to Adam's arrest. Clint's brow furrowed as he scanned the documents. The emails were encrypted, but Sarah had managed to decrypt some of them. It was clear that someone inside the company had been manipulating the system for months. But the real bombshell was buried deeper in the trail. The messages pointed to a larger conspiracy, something far beyond just one rogue employee. There were references to shady dealings, the kind of business practices that could destroy careers if they came to light. This is it, Clint muttered under his breath. This is the break we've been waiting for. Clint could hardly contain his excitement. This was the evidence they needed, proof that Adam Miller had been framed by someone inside the company. They had the smoking gun, but they had to be careful. Revealing it too early could backfire, especially with the jury still on edge. It was time for Clint to take his strategy up a notch. The next day in court, Clint was ready. He'd spent hours strategizing with his team, refining their argument, and perfecting the timing. Today, he would play his final card. The prosecution was up first, with their final witness, the company's CEO, Claire Westbrook. Claire had been a key player throughout the case. Her testimony had been sharp and unwavering, painting Adam as the clear culprit. But Clint had something she didn't expect, a game changer. Clint stood up as Claire took the stand. "Ms. Westbrook," Clint began, "thank you for joining us today. I'd like to revisit the investigation into Adam Miller's activities. As the CEO of the company, surely you must have a full understanding of your employees' actions. What can you tell us about Adam's involvement in this financial irregularity?" Claire smiled confidently, ready to assert her control over the situation. Adam Miller was a trusted employee. He had the credentials and access necessary to carry out the transfers. It's quite clear from our records that he was involved in the illegal transactions. Clint nodded, maintaining eye contact. "Yes, the records say so. But records can be altered, can't they? The company's financial systems are open to manipulation, and it's possible that someone with the right knowledge could make it appear as though Adam was responsible." "Is that possible?" Claire's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "That's a baseless accusation. Our systems are secure. Only authorized personnel have access to sensitive information." Clint leaned forward, his voice firm. "But here's the thing, Ms. Westbrook. Our investigation has uncovered something you didn't expect. A set of emails, hidden within your company's internal communication system, which clearly shows that someone with high-level access has been communicating with an outside party for months, long before this incident occurred. And, Ms. Westbrook, one of those communications includes a detailed plan that directly mentions Adam Miller, suggesting he could be framed for this crime." The courtroom went silent. Claire's face drained of color. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. It was a subtle shift, but Clint knew he had her. The audience could feel the change in the atmosphere, and Clint's heart began to race. The moment of truth had arrived. "Would you like to explain that, Ms. Westbrook?" Clint pressed. "Would you like to explain why these emails, linked to your company's system, directly implicate someone else? Someone who had the motive, the knowledge, and the access to frame Adam Miller for this crime?" Claire opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was visibly shaken, her confidence evaporating under Clint's direct gaze. Clint took a step back and let the weight of his words sink in. He turned to the jury, his voice calm yet resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is more than just a case of financial misconduct. This is a case of manipulation and deceit, aimed at pinning the blame on an innocent man. Adam Miller didn't steal a dime. But someone in this company wanted to make sure you believed he did. And we've just exposed the truth." The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as the jury looked between Clint and Claire. For the first time, it was clear that the prosecution's case had cracks, huge, glaring ones. Clint had done what no one had expected. He had turned the tables completely. That evening, Clint sat in his office, reviewing the day's events. His phone buzzed, and he looked at the screen. It was a text from Sarah. "I think we've got them. They're rattled. Westbrook's team is scrambling to cover their tracks." Clint smiled to himself, but there was no time to relax. The game wasn't over yet, and they couldn't let their guard down. There were still too many questions unanswered. But Clint had done something few lawyers could do, he had revealed the heart of the conspiracy, the truth that no one could deny. As Clint prepared for the final round, he knew one thing for sure, the case had taken a dramatic turn. And now, with the evidence he had, he could finally give Adam the justice he deserved. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the final day of the trial arrived. Clint Eastwood sat at his desk, the weight of the case pressing down on him. Today would be the day that would either set Adam Miller free or condemn him to a future he didn't deserve. The jury had been exposed to the truth of the case. Clint's revelation of the emails had thrown the prosecution's entire narrative into question. But Clint knew better than to assume the victory was already in his grasp. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. The prosecution had one last chance to rebut Clint's claims, and Clint had no doubt they would fight tooth and nail. The defense had presented a powerful argument, but now it was time for the final confrontation, the point of no return. Every word, every piece of evidence, every argument from here on out would matter. Clint turned to his team. Sarah, his lead investigator, looked tense but resolute. She had been with him through thick and thin, and he could tell she was ready for whatever came next. He looked at her and gave a small nod of reassurance. Let's finish this. The court session began promptly, and the atmosphere was electric. The jury was watching closely, their eyes darting between Clint and the prosecution. It was clear that the tension had reached a boiling point. The judge, an experienced figure who had presided over countless trials, could hardly mask his own growing curiosity about the direction the case was taking. The prosecution's lead attorney, Marcus Holloway, rose from his seat. He was a seasoned litigator, known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to sway even the most skeptical jury members. His confidence was palpable as he approached the witness stand. Your Honor, members of the jury, Holloway began, we have heard the defense's claims that Adam Miller is the victim of a grand conspiracy. But let us be clear about one thing, this case is not about emails, not about hearsay, and certainly not about any fabricated stories. This case is about cold, hard facts. And the facts are simple. Adam Miller had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to steal from his company. That's why he's here today. Holloway's words were calculated, and Clint could sense the attempt to regain control of the narrative. The prosecution was attempting to discredit the evidence Clint had uncovered, dismissing it as speculation. But Clint knew that they couldn't erase the truth that had been laid out. Holloway turned to the jury, his voice steady. We've presented irrefutable evidence, and all the defense has is conjecture. Adam Miller may try to paint himself as the innocent man in this situation, but the truth is undeniable. The financial records, the transfers, the emails, everything points to him. The only question left is whether you will allow yourselves to be swayed by the defense's emotional tactics or if you will hold Adam Miller accountable for his actions. Clint sat up straighter, his expression hardening. Holloway was trying to paint him and his client as mere manipulators. The emotional appeal Clint had worked so hard to create, the human connection with the jury, was being cast aside as if it were nothing more than a sleight of hand. But Clint knew better than to let this moment pass. He rose slowly, the entire courtroom turning to him. It was his time. His voice broke through the murmur of the room with calm precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Clint began, his voice carrying with it the weight of the truth, I want to thank you for your attention. Today, we've heard the prosecution's version of events. They've presented their facts. But let's not be fooled. Facts are only part of the story. They are pieces of a larger puzzle, and if you take a step back and look at the whole picture, you will see the truth clearly. He paused, letting his words linger in the air. The prosecution would have you believe that Adam Miller is a thief, a criminal who used his position to steal from his company. But they want you to ignore the cracks in their own case. They want you to believe in the narrative they've spun without questioning it. And what happens when you stop questioning? You get blindfolded. You stop seeing the truth. Clint walked slowly toward the jury box, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the 12 jurors. Adam Miller is not the criminal here. He is the victim of a scheme that was set in motion by someone within the company. We've shown you the evidence, the emails that lead back to a shadowy figure within the company's ranks. We've shown you the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. And what we have not seen is any explanation for how a man like Adam, a man of integrity, could have been behind this crime? Clint's words hung in the air, a silence falling over the room. He turned to face the judge, who gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. Clint had successfully redirected the jury's focus. It wasn't just about the facts anymore. It was about the bigger picture, the truth they had to piece together from the small, seemingly insignificant details. "There's a reason why the prosecution's case is falling apart," Clint continued, his voice growing more intense. "It's because they've ignored the most important thing of all, the truth. They've focused on blaming one man instead of asking the real question, who was truly behind these actions? Who had the means, the motive, and the access to orchestrate a crime like this?" He turned back to face Holloway. "You have to ask yourselves, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what is the truth? Is it the one presented to you by the prosecution, who have clung to a theory without evidence, or is it the one that's been laid bare by the defense, an intricate web of lies, manipulation, and deceit?" Holloway's face was red with frustration, but Clint didn't let it distract him. His eyes stayed locked on the jury. They were listening. Clint could see it in their faces. They were beginning to understand. Adam Miller's innocence was no longer just a story, it was a reality they had to confront. The judge called a recess, and Clint stepped back from the podium, exhaling deeply. He had said everything that needed to be said. Now, all he could do was wait. Sarah approached him as the team gathered their papers. "That was a hell of a closing argument. Do you think it'll be enough?" Clint smiled slightly, though his thoughts were still racing. "I hope so. But I've been in this game long enough to know that anything can happen. But we've given them the truth. Now it's up to them to decide whether they'll follow it." Hours later, the jury filed back into the courtroom. Clint's heart raced as he took his seat. Adam sat beside him, his face pale with anticipation. The judge called the court to order. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper in his hands. "Yes, Your Honor. We have." Clint held his breath, his eyes fixed on the jury foreman. This was it. The foreman's voice rang out across the room. "We find the defendant, Adam Miller, not guilty of all charges." Clint's heart soared. The weight that had been pressing on him for so long lifted in an instant. He turned to Adam, who was staring at him in disbelief. "You did it," Clint whispered, a smile breaking through. Adam's eyes filled with tears as he nodded, overwhelmed with emotion. The courtroom erupted in a quiet murmur as the judge banged his gavel. But Clint could hardly hear it. In that moment, there was only the sense of victory. The fight was over, and justice had been served. The courthouse doors swung open as Clint Eastwood and Adam Miller stepped out into the bright sunlight. The cool afternoon breeze seemed to carry away the tension of the past few weeks, and Clint took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. Adam, on the other hand, was still in a daze. The world around him seemed surreal. He had been acquitted, but the path to this moment had been long and fraught with uncertainty. Now, with the weight of the world lifted off his shoulders, Adam felt a mix of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. "Clint. I don't even know what to say," Adam murmured, glancing up at the lawyer who had become his savior. You saved me." Clint smiled, placing a reassuring hand on Adam's shoulder. "You don't need to say anything, Adam. You're free. That's all that matters." As the two walked down the courthouse steps, the press swarmed around them, cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward Clint. The reporters were eager for a statement, hungry for insight into the man who had turned the tide in such a high-profile case. "Mr. Eastwood. How do you feel about the verdict?" one reporter shouted. Clint paused, looking directly into the sea of cameras. "The only thing that matters is that justice was served. Adam Miller was innocent from the start, and I'm just glad the jury saw that." The reporters scribbled down his words, but Clint wasn't looking for attention. His mind was elsewhere, reflecting on the process that had led them here. Despite the victory, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that this case had left a mark on him, one that would stay with him for a long time. Later that evening, Clint found himself back at his office, staring out the window as the sun set behind the city skyline. The trial was over, and the case had been won, but the feeling of triumph was tempered by something deeper. He had done his job. He had fought for justice and prevailed. But the emotional toll of the battle had taken its own toll. Every trial left behind something that didn't go away even with a win. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Sarah Green, his lead investigator, one of the few people Clint trusted without question. "Clint, I think we need to talk. It's not over. There's something I need to tell you about the emails we uncovered. Let's meet tomorrow." Clint's stomach tightened as he read the message. Even though they had won the trial, something about Sarah's words felt ominous. What was left to uncover? Had they missed something? Clint immediately replied, agreeing to meet her in the morning. There were still loose ends to tie up, and Clint knew that he couldn't afford to ignore them. The next day, Clint met Sarah at a small cafe just outside the city. They sat down, and Clint could tell from Sarah's expression that something was weighing on her mind. She was usually calm and collected, but today, she was anxious, her eyes darting around the room, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. "What's going on, Sarah?" Clint asked, his voice low. "What's bothering you?" Sarah took a deep breath before speaking, clearly grappling with how to start. "Clint, I've been going over the emails again. I know we thought we'd exposed everything, Westbrook's involvement, the internal conspiracy, but there's something more." Clint leaned in, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "Those emails, they weren't just a cover-up. They were part of something bigger. The conversations we uncovered between the company and the third party weren't just about framing Adam. They were about something much more sinister. I dug deeper, and I found more communication, encrypted files. The third party was coordinating with someone outside the company, a person with a much more powerful agenda." Clint's heart skipped a beat. "Who? Do you have a name?" Sarah hesitated before responding. "I can't be sure yet, but I've traced the messages back to someone with ties to government contracts, and there's a link to a high-ranking official who might have been involved in this from the start." Clint felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. "So we're talking about corruption at the highest level. This isn't just about corporate fraud anymore." Sarah nodded grimly. "Exactly. This was a setup, a way to cover up a larger operation. The whole thing was orchestrated, not just to frame Adam, but to distract from something much more dangerous. Whoever was behind this, they were trying to bury something." Clint stared at her for a long moment, absorbing the implications. "Do we have enough evidence to go public with this?" Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. We're only scratching the surface. But if this is as big as I think it is, then exposing it could be even more dangerous than we imagined. We could be up against people who have more power than we realize." Clint sat back in his chair, his mind racing. This was bigger than he had anticipated, much bigger. It wasn't just about one case anymore, it was about exposing a conspiracy that could reach far beyond the courtroom. For a brief moment, Clint considered walking away. He had done his part, after all. Adam was free, and the case was closed. But Clint knew that walking away wasn't an option. He had already seen the cracks in the foundation of this case, and now he knew that there was a much larger, more dangerous game being played. He met Sarah's gaze and gave a determined nod. "We need to find out everything we can. We can't let this go." Back at his office, Clint spent the next few hours organizing his thoughts, making calls, and preparing a plan of action. His mind raced with possibilities. If this conspiracy was as deep as Sarah suggested, they would need all the resources they could muster. But Clint knew there was no going back. He had just unearthed something much larger than a corporate scandal. And while Adam Miller might have walked away free, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was just beginning. Later that night, Clint sat alone in his office, staring at the papers in front of him. He had been right to trust Sarah's instincts, but what bothered him most was the realization that this case had already taken a toll on everyone involved. Adam might have been freed, but Clint knew that someone, somewhere, would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. And if Clint was going to expose the truth, he would have to be prepared for whatever came next. The clock on his desk ticked steadily, marking the passage of time. Clint closed his eyes for a moment and steadied his breath. The fight for justice was far from over. Tomorrow, they would begin the search for the truth. The following morning, Clint Eastwood stood at the window of his office, staring out over the city. His mind was still racing from the revelations Sarah had shared with him the night before. He had been involved in some complex cases over the years, but this one was different. There was something larger at play, something more dangerous than he had first realized. He turned toward the desk, where a stack of papers sat waiting. The details of the emails, the encrypted files Sarah had uncovered, all pointed to a conspiracy that extended beyond corporate corruption. It was tied to something more insidious, something that could affect the country on a much larger scale. Clint knew he needed to move quickly, but with the stakes so high, every decision had to be made carefully. One wrong move, and they could find themselves facing enemies far more powerful than anyone they had dealt with before. He reached for his phone and dialed Sarah's number. The line rang once, twice, and then she picked up. "Clint," Sarah's voice came through, calm but with an undercurrent of urgency. "I've done some more digging. I think I've got a solid lead on the identity of the person behind the third-party connections." Clint felt a jolt of adrenaline. "What did you find?" "Follow the money," Sarah replied cryptically. "I traced the encrypted transfers to an offshore account, and there's a name tied to it, Edgar Bishop. He's a lobbyist with ties to several high-profile politicians. He's been moving millions around, but it's all been hidden under the radar." Clint frowned. "Bishop. I've heard that name before. He's connected to the government contracts we suspected." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "But there's more. Bishop's company has been funneling money through multiple shell corporations, and a portion of that has gone into the campaigns of some key figures in Washington. This is much bigger than a corporate scam, it's about political influence and manipulation at the highest level." Clint's stomach tightened. He had suspected that there was something more sinister behind the scenes, but the extent of it was still shocking. If Bishop is involved in this, it means we're dealing with powerful people. We need to be careful about how we move forward. "I know," Sarah said. "But Clint, I'm telling you, this is just the beginning. The more I look into it, the clearer it becomes that this conspiracy is designed to cover up something massive. And it's not just Adam Miller they were trying to frame. We're talking about the lives of millions of people being manipulated behind the scenes." Clint stood up, pacing as he thought through the implications. "We have to get to Bishop, but we need to build a case that'll hold up. If we go in without solid proof, we'll get buried." "Agreed. I'm working on getting access to his financial records, but we'll need someone on the inside to get us further. It's going to be difficult, Clint. But if we don't take action, this thing will spiral out of control." Clint was quiet for a moment, his mind calculating the next steps. Finally, he spoke. "I'll reach out to some of my contacts in the federal government. If anyone can help us get access to Bishop's network, it's them. Be careful. We can't trust just anyone with this," Sarah warned. Clint hung up the phone and sank into his chair, his mind churning. Every move from this point on would be delicate. The conspiracy had already proven its reach: high-ranking government officials, powerful lobbyists. There was no way to predict who else might be involved. But one thing was clear: Clint could no longer work within the confines of the courtroom. This case had become a battle on a much larger stage, and Clint was ready for the fight. As the days passed, Clint worked tirelessly to gather information. He reached out to a trusted contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Agent Laura Fields. She was a no-nonsense investigator with a reputation for getting results. Clint trusted her, but even with her help, it felt like they were walking on a razor's edge. He sat in his office late one evening when his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sarah. "I've got something." Bishop scheduled a meeting with a high-ranking senator. They're meeting in the next few days. We can't miss this opportunity. Clint's pulse quickened. This was the break they had been waiting for. If they could intercept this meeting, they might have the evidence they needed to take Bishop down. He immediately picked up the phone and called Sarah. "I'm on it. We need to move fast. I'll get the details on the location and time. We need to be ready for anything." Clint hung up, feeling the weight of the moment pressing on him. This wasn't just about Adam Miller anymore. This was about uncovering a conspiracy that could change the course of history. The meeting with Bishop and the senator could be the key to everything. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Clint, Sarah, and a small team of trusted allies worked in the shadows, setting up surveillance on the senator's office and tracking Bishop's movements. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The night before the meeting, Clint sat in his office again, staring at the files spread out in front of him. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. He thought about Adam, how far he had come since the trial. It seemed like a lifetime ago, and yet the battle was far from over. Clint's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Laura Fields at the FBI. "We've got confirmation," Laura said, her voice crisp. "Bishop and the senator will meet tomorrow afternoon at a private conference room in a hotel downtown. We're moving in at 2 p.m. sharp. Be ready." Clint hung up and took a deep breath. This was it. The moment they had been waiting for. Tomorrow, they would finally confront the people who had been behind the conspiracy. But Clint couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting was only the beginning. They were about to open a door that could reveal even more corruption, even more secrets. And once they stepped through that door, there would be no turning back. The next day, Clint stood outside the hotel, watching as people hurried in and out. His team was already in position, cameras set up in the lobby in the corridors. Clint adjusted his jacket and took a deep breath. He was ready. But he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. What if they were walking into a trap? As the clock neared 2 p.m., Clint and Sarah made their way to the back of the hotel. The senator's meeting with Bishop was happening in a private suite, and Clint had every intention of being there when it happened. They slipped into the back hallway and positioned themselves outside the conference room. Clint motioned for Sarah to stay low, and they waited in silence. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, the door to the conference room opened, and Clint saw Bishop and the senator step out, laughing and exchanging pleasantries. Clint motioned for his team to move in quickly. Before anyone could react, Clint pushed open the door to the conference room. The senator and Bishop froze. "Gentlemen," Clint said, his voice cold, "I think it's time we had a conversation." The atmosphere in the conference room was thick with tension as Clint Eastwood stood face to face with Edgar Bishop and the senator. The room, once filled with the quiet hum of a private conversation, had suddenly become a battleground. Clint's piercing gaze was fixed on Bishop, who looked momentarily stunned by the intrusion, while the senator's face contorted in an expression of nervousness that Clint couldn't ignore. "Mr. Eastwood," Bishop said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is a surprise. What's this all about?" The senator, still recovering from the shock, straightened his tie and cleared his throat. "I don't think this is appropriate. We have a meeting scheduled, and we—" Clint cut him off, his voice steady and cold. "This is exactly what I'm here for, Senator. And as for you, Bishop, I think we need to have a much longer conversation about your little operation." There was a beat of silence. Clint could almost feel the room hold its breath as he stepped further into the room. Behind him, Sarah, a few trusted members of his team, and an agent from the FBI had positioned themselves just outside the door, ready for any escalation. Clint had come prepared. No matter how powerful Bishop or the senator were, Clint wasn't going to back down now. "Listen," Bishop said, attempting to regain control, his voice edged with defensiveness. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. There are bigger forces at play here than you realize." Clint raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I know exactly what's going on. The question is, how much of this mess are you willing to take responsibility for?" Bishop's hand twitched as if he was about to reach for something on the table, a phone, maybe, or a weapon, but Clint was quicker, his eyes sharp as ever. "Let me make this clear," Clint said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "You've been part of something far more dangerous than just corporate fraud, Bishop. It's not just about money or manipulation anymore. It's about power, power over people's lives. And I won't let you get away with it." The senator shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face pale. "You don't know what you're doing, Eastwood. This isn't just some petty crime. You're talking about a national issue. If you keep going down this path, you won't just ruin lives, you'll ruin your own." Clint ignored the senator, his attention focused entirely on Bishop. "You thought you could get away with this. You thought that with your connections, you could control everything from behind the scenes. But you made one mistake, you underestimated me." Sarah, standing behind Clint, stepped forward, holding up a file with a stack of documents. "We've got the evidence, Bishop. It's all right here. Bank records, encrypted files, names, dates. You can't hide anymore." Bishop's face flickered with panic, but he quickly masked it with arrogance. "You think you've won, don't you? But there's always more. You have no idea who's really pulling the strings. You think you're going to expose me and walk away unscathed? You don't know who you're dealing with." Clint smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think I do. You're just a pawn, Bishop. And I'm not done yet." There was a pause, a long, pregnant silence where the weight of Clint's words sank in. Bishop's bravado cracked, and for the first time, Clint saw the true fear behind the man's eyes. It was subtle but unmistakable. The senator stood up abruptly, his hands raised in a defensive gesture. "We're not having this conversation here. I'm calling security, and we're leaving. Now." But Clint's response was immediate and firm. "You're not going anywhere." With a signal from Clint, Sarah stepped forward and handed the file to the senator. "You need to read this," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "You're in this deeper than you think." The senator glanced at the file with growing concern, but before he could respond, Bishop stood up, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. "Enough of this," he snapped, his hand flying to his coat pocket. Clint's instincts kicked in, his eyes tracking Bishop's movement. Without hesitation, Clint reached for his own sidearm, his movements fluid and controlled. But he didn't draw the weapon yet. He wasn't here to escalate the situation, he just needed to keep control. "Sit down, Bishop," Clint ordered, his voice low and commanding. For a moment, it seemed like Bishop would push back, but then his shoulders slumped, and he reluctantly sat back down, his hand withdrawing from his pocket. Clint kept his eyes locked on him, never wavering. "Now, here's what's going to happen," Clint said, his tone final. "You're going to tell me everything. And when you do, we'll get this information to the authorities. If you don't cooperate, well, I'm not the only one who knows how to expose the truth. You'll be outed, and this won't just end your career, it'll ruin everything you've built." Bishop's mouth opened and closed as if he were searching for something to say, but no words came. His facade had shattered, and Clint could see that he was cornered. The senator, however, was still trying to regain control of the situation. He straightened his jacket again and took a step toward Clint, his voice shaking. You can't just. Clint interrupted him again, his gaze hardening. I think it's time for you to leave, Senator. You've already shown your cards, and now you're going to face the consequences. The senator didn't say another word, but it was clear that Clint's words had struck a nerve. He backed away slowly, retreating to the door without a fight. As the senator left, Clint turned his attention back to Bishop. The room was still, save for the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. Clint could feel the moment growing more intense, the final confrontation between them inevitable. So, Bishop, Clint began again, are you going to talk? Or do I need to make things more difficult for you? The tension in the room was palpable. Bishop's face flushed with a mixture of anger and fear, but Clint wasn't about to let him walk out of here without giving up everything. I'll talk, Bishop finally muttered, his voice a low growl. But you don't understand what you're getting yourself into. This isn't just about me. It's bigger than you think. Clint smiled grimly. We'll see about that. Hours later, Clint and his team left the conference room, their mission accomplished. They had the evidence they needed, finally. Bishop had broken under pressure, and with the senator now implicated, they had a lead that would take them straight to the heart of the conspiracy. The pieces were falling into place, but Clint knew that this was only the beginning. They had cracked the facade, but there was much more to uncover, and the real battle had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood sat in his car, the hum of the engine a distant buzz as his mind raced. The quiet moments between the chaos felt too long, but he knew better than to get comfortable. Every moment of calm in a case like this was fleeting. What they had just uncovered, the evidence on Bishop, the senator's involvement, it was enough to topple a political dynasty. But Clint wasn't thinking about the victories yet. He was thinking about the storm that was coming. The conversation with Bishop had cracked something wide open, but Clint knew the man had only given them part of the story. There were bigger players involved, and Bishop's warnings rang in his ears. This isn't just about me. It's bigger than you think. He glanced over at Sarah, who sat in the passenger seat, her eyes on the phone in her hand as she reviewed the files. She hadn't said much since their confrontation with Bishop, but Clint could sense the weight of everything pressing on her. We've got a lot of work ahead, Clint said, breaking the silence. Sarah looked up, her gaze sharp. You're right. The documents we have are just the tip of the iceberg. If we can connect Bishop to the other players, maybe even higher up, it could change everything. Clint nodded, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. We need to move fast. There are too many moving parts, and we're getting close to something dangerous. We can't give them a chance to cover their tracks. The next day, Clint and Sarah met with Agent Laura Fields at a secure location. The tension was high, but there was an undeniable sense of urgency in the air. The FBI was already moving to bring in Bishop for questioning, but Clint knew that getting him to talk was just one part of the puzzle. The deeper conspiracy wasn't going to be solved with a single interview. Clint, Laura said as they sat down around a table, we've been reviewing the intel, and there's a pattern that's emerging. Bishop's connections aren't just limited to Washington. He's linked to international figures, high-ranking officials and businessmen with questionable ties. It's global. Clint raised an eyebrow. Global? How deep does this go? We're still piecing things together, but it's clear that this isn't just about political influence. There's money moving across borders, arms deals, drug trafficking, financial manipulations. It's a network that could go all the way to the top. Sarah exchanged a look with Clint. If what you're saying is true, we're not just dealing with corporate fraud anymore. We're talking about a full-scale international conspiracy. Laura nodded grimly. That's exactly what we're dealing with. And if we don't act fast, these people will bury everything before we have a chance to make a move. Clint leaned forward, his expression hardening. We need to hit them where it hurts. If we can disrupt their finances, expose their network, we can take them down. Sarah's eyes flickered as she read through the files. I've been tracing the money trail. There's a hidden offshore account in the Caymans that's been used to funnel funds from Bishop's companies to various politicians and international figures. I think that's where we should start. Laura's eyes locked onto Sarah. If you're right, we're looking at a major operation. It's not just a few crooked officials anymore. This is organized crime with a capital O. Clint stood up, pacing as he thought through their options. They had Bishop in their corner now, but they needed more. The senator was already in their sights, and his connections were undeniable. But the global scale of the operation made everything more complex. They couldn't rely solely on Bishop's testimony. They needed access to the financial records, the offshore accounts, and the hidden networks that tied everyone together. We need to get to those accounts, Clint said, his voice decisive. If we can find a way to freeze the funds, we'll have leverage. They won't be able to move or hide their money. Sarah's fingers flew over her phone as she worked on the data. I can dig deeper into the accounts, but we'll need someone with authority to make it happen. Without proper legal backing, we'll just be spinning our wheels. Laura nodded. I can make some calls, but it'll take time. In the meantime, we need to be careful. If they catch wind of what we're doing, they'll do everything in their power to shut us down. And we're not just talking about politics anymore. These people have the means to make anyone disappear. Clint's eyes hardened. We'll take the risk. But we move fast. No more waiting. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning, coordination, and relentless pressure. Clint's team worked around the clock to track down every lead, while Sarah dug deeper into the financials, uncovering more and more ties to shadowy figures across the globe. But as they closed in, they could feel the storm gathering on the horizon. Someone was watching them, and it wasn't just the FBI. It was the people they were going after. On the third day after their meeting with Laura, Clint received an unexpected visitor. He had just stepped out of his office when he saw a familiar figure in the hallway, Agent Fields, her face grim and tight with worry. Clint, she said, her voice low, we've got a problem. Clint's heart skipped a beat. What happened? It's Bishop, Laura said. He's gone. Vanished. The team was just about to bring him in for questioning when he disappeared. There's no trace of him, no surveillance footage, no signs of a struggle. It's like he vanished into thin air. Clint's jaw clenched. He's gone underground. They tipped him off. We think so. But there's more, Laura added, pulling out a tablet and showing Clint the latest intel. The senator's office was just raided this morning. We found evidence linking him directly to the offshore accounts and multiple illegal dealings. They knew it was coming. Clint ran a hand through his hair. They're scrambling. This is exactly what we needed, proof of their involvement. But now they're going to come for us. We can't waste any more time. Laura's eyes were hard, her resolve as sharp as Clint's. We'll move on the accounts. We'll get them before they can hide everything. But we need to act now. Clint nodded, his mind working quickly. The game had changed. They were no longer just working to expose a conspiracy, they were now in the fight of their lives. The people they were up against weren't just corrupt, they were dangerous. We'll take them down, Clint said. And we'll make sure they never come back. As Clint prepared for the next stage of their mission, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling faster than he could keep up with. Bishop had slipped through their fingers, but the senator's downfall had been a victory. Yet with every move they made, the conspiracy deepened. There was no turning back now. The news of Bishop's disappearance hit Clint like a slap in the face. It was a blow, one that sent ripples through his carefully laid plans, but Clint had never been one to buckle under pressure. If anything, it only fueled his resolve. Bishop might have slipped through their fingers, but the conspiracy wasn't going to vanish just because one man was gone. Clint sat at his desk, staring at the files laid out before him. The walls of the office seemed to close in as he sifted through the papers, his mind racing through the possible next steps. They couldn't afford to waste any time. With Bishop gone and the senator now in deep trouble, the criminals they were up against were going to double down. But Clint wasn't worried about them, not yet. What concerned him now was how many others were involved, and how deep the corruption ran. He rubbed his eyes and looked at the team gathered around the conference table. Sarah sat across from him, her laptop open as she scanned through more encrypted files, trying to pull together the last pieces of the puzzle. Agent Laura Fields was on the phone with someone in the FBI, trying to arrange a search of one of the senator's offshore accounts, while Clint tapped his fingers on the table, contemplating their next move. "We need to find a way to get ahead of them," Clint said, breaking the silence. His voice was low but filled with the kind of intensity that made everyone in the room pay attention. "Bishop's gone, but the senator isn't far behind. He's still a target, and the people pulling the strings are going to try to bury him." Sarah closed her laptop with a soft click, her eyes sharp. "They might think they can cover it all up, but we've got a ton of leverage. The senator's financial records are already in the hands of the authorities, and the offshore accounts, those won't disappear. We're not just chasing ghosts anymore. We have evidence. Real evidence." Clint nodded, but there was something about Sarah's tone that made him wary. The sense of urgency in the room was palpable, but it was also clear that their next move needed to be calculated. If they rushed this, if they made a misstep, they risked everything. "The problem is that we don't know how far this goes," Clint said. "Bishop knew something we didn't, something bigger than what we've uncovered so far. And the more we dig, the more I feel like we're just scratching the surface." Laura hung up the phone and walked over, her face tight with frustration. "We've got another issue. We've lost contact with the senator's legal team. No one's answering their phones, and the senator hasn't been seen since his office was raided. It's like he vanished." Clint's gut twisted. If he's gone, then that means someone's controlling the strings behind the scenes. They've got resources we don't even know about yet. He stood up abruptly, his mind racing through possible scenarios. "We need to get to the bottom of this before they completely erase the evidence. If they've got people like Bishop running interference, then we need to outsmart them. We've already got a head start. Do you think Bishop's disappearance is part of a larger plan?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I don't think it was random," Clint replied. "They knew we were closing in. Bishop was a liability, and now they're trying to cover their tracks. But we can't let that stop us." Laura looked at Clint, her eyes narrowing with a sense of determination. "We're going to need more than just evidence. If these people are as powerful as you say they are, we're going to need to be smarter, faster, and we're going to need allies. Real ones." Clint turned to face her. "I've got one ally we can trust, but we need to be careful. This isn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It's about staying alive long enough to do it." The team worked late into the night. Clint didn't need to look at the clock to know how long they had been at it. Time seemed to lose all meaning when you were chasing a conspiracy that was trying to tear everything apart. Sarah continued to pore over the files, her eyes glazed with exhaustion, while Laura made more calls, trying to track down any leads on the senator's whereabouts. Clint found himself alone in his office at one point, staring at the window. The city lights twinkled outside, but there was a shadow hanging over him, a sense of inevitability that this wasn't going to end cleanly. As the hours passed, Clint's mind wandered back to something Bishop had said before he disappeared: "You don't know who you're dealing with, Eastwood." It wasn't just empty bravado. Bishop had known something Clint didn't, and now it was his mission to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. Around 3 a.m., Clint's phone rang, the sound breaking through the silence of the office. He answered it immediately, not bothering with pleasantries. "This better be good," he muttered. It was Agent Fields. Her voice was tight, the kind of tone that only came with bad news. "Clint, we've got a problem." Clint's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "The senator's gone. We can't track him, and all signs point to him being picked up by someone with serious resources. But that's not the worst part." She paused, and Clint could hear the unease in her voice. "We found a lead. There's a man in the Cayman Islands, someone who's been coordinating the transfers. He's the key to everything, Clint. He knows what's going on, and he's the one pulling the strings." Clint didn't hesitate. "Get me everything you've got on him. We'll need to move quickly." Fields was silent for a moment. "Clint, this guy's not just a banker or a businessman. He's connected to some of the most dangerous people in the world. If we go after him, we're opening a door that we might not be able to close." Clint felt the weight of her words, but there was no turning back now. He had come too far to back out. "I'm not going to sit here and wait for them to cover their tracks. I'll take the risk." The next morning, Clint and Sarah met with a small group of trusted allies, preparing for the next leg of their journey. The Cayman Islands would be their next stop, but Clint knew that the deeper they got, the more perilous it would become. They had to tread carefully, and every step needed to be measured. "There's no turning back," Clint said, his voice low but resolute. "This is the moment where everything either comes together, or falls apart." Sarah looked at him, a quiet determination in her eyes. "We'll make it work. We always do." As the team boarded their plane to the Cayman Islands, Clint couldn't help but think about how far they had come. They were now in a race against time to bring down an international conspiracy, and the enemies they faced were more dangerous than anything they had encountered before. But Clint Eastwood wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The flight to the Cayman Islands felt like a lifetime. Clint sat in a cramped cabin, staring out the small window, his mind racing through the information they had gathered so far. Each new piece of the puzzle only made the picture more complex. They had a lead, an elusive financier tied to the offshore accounts, but the closer they got, the more Clint realized they were dealing with something far more dangerous than he had initially believed. As the plane descended toward the island, Clint couldn't help but feel a gnawing unease. The Cayman Islands, with its white sandy beaches and turquoise waters, were a paradise for vacationers. But for Clint and his team, it was about to become a battleground. He glanced over at Sarah, who had her laptop open, furiously typing away as she reviewed the intel they'd received on the man they were after. Her eyes flicked up, meeting his gaze with a quiet understanding. "We're getting close," she said, her voice steady, despite the anxiety that lingered in the air. Clint gave a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Too close. We need to be careful. Whoever is behind this operation has more power than we think. This is more than just dirty politicians and shady businessmen. We're dealing with a network that has the resources to destroy us if we make one wrong move." The moment they landed, they were greeted by the stifling heat of the island air. Clint could feel the sweat already gathering on the back of his neck. The team quickly gathered their bags and made their way to the rental cars they'd arranged. The entire operation had been set up to be as low profile as possible. No one could know they were here, not even the locals. "I think it's time to meet with our contact," Clint said as he led the way to a nondescript black SUV. "We can't afford to waste any time. We need information on this guy, his whereabouts, his connections, everything." The contact Clint referred to was an old acquaintance, someone he trusted but who didn't come without risks. The man had his own history with the island's shadowy underworld, and Clint hoped that his connections would provide the crucial details they needed to get closer to the man behind the conspiracy. They arrived at a rundown bar on the outskirts of Georgetown, the capital of the Cayman Islands. It was a quiet place, hidden behind thick curtains and overgrown vines, as if it had been forgotten by time. Clint entered first, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of trouble. Sarah followed closely behind, and Laura brought up the rear. They'd arranged to meet their contact here under the guise of a business deal. No one could know what they were truly after. The contact, a man named Victor Donovan, was sitting in the back corner booth, sipping from a tumbler of amber liquid. His face was weathered, with a scar that ran down the side of his neck, a souvenir from his past life. When he saw Clint, his lips curled into a half-smile, but there was no warmth in his eyes. He had long ago learned that trust in this line of work was a luxury few could afford. Clint slid into the booth across from him, keeping his tone low. "You're a hard man to track down, Donovan." Victor shrugged. "Not many people know how to find me when I don't want to be found. But you're different, Clint. You always were." Clint gave him a measured look. "I'm here for information. We need to know everything about a man named Alain Moreau. He's connected to the senator's offshore accounts, and we believe he's the one who's been pulling the strings behind the scenes." Donovan's eyes flickered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Moreau's a dangerous man. He's got his hands in a lot of pies, money laundering, arms dealing, even some shady dealings in the tech world. But he's not someone you can just walk up to and ask questions. You'll need to be careful." Sarah leaned forward, her voice steady. "We're prepared to take the risk. We need to know where he is and how to reach him." Victor took another sip from his glass, contemplating their request. "I've got a few people who know where Moreau's been hiding out. But you won't like it. He's been laying low in one of the private estates outside of the main city. It's a heavily guarded place. Getting in won't be easy." Clint's jaw tightened. "We don't need easy. We just need to get to him." Victor nodded slowly. "I can help you, but it's not going to be cheap. Moreau doesn't like people poking around his business, and I don't like getting caught in the crossfire. If you want to move on him, I'll need protection, some assurances that you can keep me out of it when the bullets start flying." Clint studied Victor for a moment, weighing his options. This was a delicate game, but they didn't have the luxury of time. The senator's downfall was just the beginning, and the deeper they dug, the more enemies they made. "Fine," Clint said, his voice firm. "We'll make sure you're covered. But we need that location, and we need it now." Victor didn't hesitate. "I'll get it to you, but you'll need to be quick. If Moreau catches wind of what you're planning, he won't hesitate to have you all taken care of." Clint stood up, throwing a few bills on the table. "We'll be ready." As they left the bar, Clint's mind was already turning over their next steps. They had the information they needed, but the risks were high. Getting to Moreau was going to be dangerous, but Clint wasn't backing down now. He had made too many sacrifices to let this operation fail. The team made their way back to the rental cars, but just as they were about to drive off, Clint's phone rang. He answered it without a second thought. "Clint Eastwood," he said, his voice cool. There was a brief pause before the voice on the other end spoke. "You're getting too close, Clint. You should walk away while you still can." It was a warning, but Clint knew better than to let threats deter him. He could feel the danger closing in, but that only pushed him to go further. "We're not walking away," Clint replied, his voice low and dangerous. "We're coming for you. And you won't be able to hide." As Clint and his team prepared for the confrontation ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to enter the lion's den. They had the location of Moreau's estate, and they were ready to move, but Clint knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Every step they took brought them closer to the heart of a conspiracy that spanned continents, and the people behind it would stop at nothing to protect themselves. There was no turning back now. The night in the Cayman Islands was quiet, too quiet for Clint's liking. The team had gotten their information, and now, the waiting game began. They knew where Alain Moreau was hiding, but the journey to his estate would be anything but simple. The island was small, but the network of private properties and guarded compounds was extensive. Moreau wasn't just a criminal, he was a mastermind, calculating, elusive, and well protected. Clint sat in his hotel room, the lights off, his back against the wall, eyes focused on the map of the island spread out before him. He had gone over every detail of Moreau's estate. The location was on a secluded hill, miles from the main town, shrouded by thick foliage and patrolled by armed guards. Getting in undetected would be nearly impossible, but Clint wasn't in the business of playing it safe. He was going to go after Moreau no matter what it took. The next morning, Clint met with his team at a small cafe tucked away in the corner of Georgetown. The air was thick with humidity, and the sun was already beating down, but Clint's focus was razor-sharp. They couldn't afford any distractions now. "Here's the plan," Clint began, his voice low. "We're going to hit the estate hard and fast. We don't have the luxury of time. We'll divide into 2 teams. Sarah, you and Laura will handle the west side of the compound. There's a gap in the security fence. You'll work your way in and disable the outer perimeter cameras. Once that's done, you'll clear a path for the rest of us." He turned to look at Victor Donovan, who was sitting across the table, his hands folded in front of him. "Donovan, you've got the intel on the guards. What's the best way to handle the security inside?" Victor, who had grown more uncomfortable since the team's arrival, shifted in his seat. "Inside the estate, it's going to be tricky. Moreau's personal security is well trained, but they're not expecting an attack. The key is to get in quick, avoid the front entrance. There's a smaller access point through the lower service road that will give you a better shot at catching them off guard." Clint nodded. "We'll split up when we get inside. You, Donovan, will stick with me. We'll take the main house. The rest of the team will sweep the grounds and make sure no one gets out." The group went over the final details, discussing their routes, contingencies, and possible escape plans. The clock was ticking, and Clint knew that any misstep could lead to disaster. Once the plan was solid, they geared up. Each of them was armed with what they needed for a quiet but efficient infiltration. Clint felt the weight of the handgun on his side, the familiar reassurance of the tool that had gotten him out of more tight situations than he cared to remember. But even with all the preparation, Clint couldn't ignore the knot forming in his stomach. This wasn't going to be easy. By late afternoon, they were en route to Moreau's estate. The estate itself was a massive compound, sprawling across a hillside and surrounded by dense jungle. Clint had been to places like this before, but there was something about this mission that felt different. It wasn't just about the mission anymore, it was about survival. As their convoy of vehicles made its way up the winding road, Clint kept a careful eye on their surroundings. They were nearing the compound, and soon, they would have to move quickly. The team moved in silence, no unnecessary conversation, all of them on high alert. Once they arrived, Sarah and Laura immediately made their way to the west side, slipping through the jungle with the grace of seasoned operatives. Clint and Donovan, meanwhile, took the main approach, driving as close as they could to the service road. They parked just out of sight, hidden by the thick trees and underbrush. "We'll move in on foot from here," Clint whispered to Donovan as they began to move. The estate was large, but it wasn't impenetrable. The security guards, though well trained, weren't expecting a coordinated assault like this one. With Sarah and Laura handling the exterior cameras and signals, Clint felt they had the advantage, at least for now. They reached the perimeter of the estate, where the thick foliage gave way to the hidden access point. Donovan, who had been here many times before, motioned for Clint to follow him. They passed through the service entrance without detection, and Clint's heart began to race. This was it. Inside, the air was cooler, the mansion's high ceilings creating an eerie stillness. They were in the belly of the beast now. Suddenly, Clint froze, his instincts kicking in as he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. He signaled for Donovan to hide, and they both ducked behind a large marble column. The footsteps drew closer. A security guard, his weapon slung over his shoulder, appeared from around the corner, walking slowly, seemingly unaware of the danger. Clint's eyes narrowed. It was now or never. With a swift motion, he pulled his silenced pistol and shot the guard in the shoulder, incapacitating him instantly. Donovan, quick on the draw, moved in to ensure the guard didn't make a sound. "Let's move," Clint muttered, and they continued deeper into the mansion. The main house was dark, only lit by the soft glow of security lights. As they moved down a narrow hallway, Clint could feel the tension in the air. He knew Moreau was close. Suddenly, the sound of a door opening echoed through the hallway. Clint motioned for Donovan to take the right side while he went left. They were closing in on Moreau's office, where they knew he kept the most important documents and data. They reached the door to the office and stopped. Clint gave Donovan a sharp look, and Donovan nodded, his hand on the handle. With a quick twist, the door opened, and Clint immediately swept in, gun raised. But what they found inside wasn't what they expected. Alain Moreau wasn't alone. A woman sat at his desk, flipping through documents as if the world outside didn't exist. Moreau was standing by the window, speaking on the phone, and he didn't notice Clint's entrance. The moment Clint stepped into the room, he knew they had to act fast. "Get down!" Clint shouted as he lunged for Moreau. The woman jumped in surprise, knocking over a glass of water as she scrambled out of the way. Moreau's eyes widened in shock, but before he could react, Clint's gun was already aimed at him. "Clint Eastwood," Moreau sneered, the fear in his eyes barely concealed. "I should have known you'd come for me." Clint's grip on his gun tightened. "This ends tonight." The room was tense, thick with the weight of anticipation. Clint's gun was aimed squarely at Alain Moreau, but something about the scene felt off. The woman by Moreau's desk, who had clearly been caught off guard, was now inching toward the door, her face pale. Moreau, for all his bravado, was standing frozen, his hand still holding the phone, the faint trace of fear in his eyes. Clint's mind raced. Something didn't add up. Moreau wasn't acting like a man cornered. His usual smugness was absent, replaced by a peculiar calm. "Who is she?" Clint demanded, keeping his voice steady. "What's going on here, Moreau?" Moreau's gaze flicked briefly to the woman, then back to Clint. He didn't answer immediately, as if buying time for something. His fingers tightened on the phone, and for a moment, Clint wondered if he was about to make a call that could bring the entire house down on them. But then the woman spoke. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice smooth but tinged with something Clint couldn't place, fear, perhaps, or perhaps something more calculated. "This isn't just about him. It's about all of us." Clint's eyes narrowed. "I'm not here to negotiate, sweetheart. This is over." Before he could react, the phone in Moreau's hand rang loudly, breaking the standoff. Clint's instincts flared, and his finger twitched toward the trigger. But Moreau didn't reach for the phone. Instead, he looked at it with an unreadable expression. "You're too late," Moreau said quietly, his voice chilling in its calmness. "You think you've got it all figured out, Clint. You've got a piece of the puzzle, but it's too big for you. Too dangerous. You have no idea who's really behind all of this." Clint's heart skipped a beat. He didn't let his guard down, but that sentence hit him like a physical blow. Who else was involved? The people pulling the strings had always been elusive, but Clint had never imagined there could be someone more powerful than Moreau himself. "You'll find out soon enough," Moreau added with a sneer. "But by then, it'll be too late for you." Clint was about to retort when his radio buzzed in his ear. Sarah's voice came through, low and urgent. "Clint, we've got movement. Multiple cars heading toward the compound from the south. We don't have much time." That was all Clint needed to hear. He had no intention of wasting another second. The clock was ticking. Clint moved swiftly, his hand still trained on Moreau, who seemed remarkably composed for someone in his position. The woman, on the other hand, was visibly shaking, her eyes darting between Clint and Moreau. "Listen, Clint," Moreau said, his tone shifting slightly. I can help you. I know who's really behind all of this. You can't stop it unless you have the full picture. If you kill me now, you'll be dead by the end of the week. And I'm not just talking about you, I'm talking about your friends, too. All of you. Clint didn't lower his gun. I'm not here for your empty threats. I'm here for answers. Who's behind this? The woman stood up from her chair slowly, her hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. Clint, she said softly. You don't understand. You can't trust him. Moreau is just one player. The real threat is far bigger than you think. Clint looked at her sharply, the weight of her words sinking in. Who was she, and why was she so afraid of Moreau? And more importantly, why should Clint believe her? Suddenly, the sound of doors opening echoed through the hallway. It was too late to turn back now. Clint, we need to move, Donovan's voice came through the radio. Get out of there, now. Clint glanced at the woman one last time, then at Moreau. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. The risk of capture was too great. He motioned to Donovan, signaling that it was time to go. I don't have time for your games, Moreau, Clint said, his voice cold. Tell me who's behind this, or I'll make sure you regret it. Moreau's face twisted into something darker, more menacing. You think you're in control, Clint? You have no idea what you're up against. What you think is a conspiracy, it's just the beginning. You're playing in their world now. With one final look, Clint turned and moved toward the door, signaling for his team to fall in line. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, signaling that their window of opportunity was closing fast. Clint's mind raced as they exited the room. They had the information they needed, but it wasn't enough. There were bigger forces at play, and Clint knew he wasn't prepared for what was coming next. As they moved through the mansion, it became clear that they weren't the only ones moving with intent. The guards were closing in, their radios crackling with orders. Clint's team made quick work of the security, but they could feel the pressure mounting. Moreau's words echoed in Clint's mind, you're playing in their world now. They reached the exit and rushed toward their vehicles. But just as they were about to load into the cars, a series of explosions rocked the compound. The blast sent Clint sprawling, his body hitting the ground hard as the shockwave reverberated through the air. The sound of gunfire erupted from all sides. His ears were ringing, and the world felt blurry for a moment, but he forced himself to focus. The plan had gone sideways. Moreau had known they were coming, and now they were walking right into a trap. Move! Get in the car! Clint yelled as he scrambled to his feet, pulling Sarah up with him. The team didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted toward the nearest car, firing back at the oncoming guards who had managed to regroup after the blast. As they climbed into the vehicle, Clint's mind was racing. The compound was no longer a safe haven, it was a battlefield. The enemy was closing in, and they had to get out fast. But as they sped away from the estate, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Moreau's warning replayed in his head. There was something bigger going on here, something Clint wasn't ready for. The team drove through the winding roads of the island, trying to put distance between themselves and the chaos they had left behind. Clint's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. He couldn't help but feel that they had just uncovered a fraction of something much larger than they had anticipated. We've got more than just Moreau to deal with, Clint muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Whoever he was talking about, those people, they're the real threat. Sarah looked over at him, her expression grave. We're not walking away from this, Clint. We're in it now. Clint nodded grimly. I know. And we're not stopping until we bring them all down. Clint's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he floored the accelerator, the vehicle swerving dangerously around the sharp corners of the narrow island roads. The explosion at Moreau's estate still echoed in his mind, the fireball that had sent a wave of destruction through the compound, taking down everything in its wake. Clint knew it was no coincidence. Moreau had expected them. The trap had been set long before they'd ever arrived. Behind him, his team was in a frenzy, trying to regroup and assess the damage. They'd lost their primary intel. They had barely managed to escape the blast, but they hadn't come away unscathed. Victor's arm was bleeding from a piece of shrapnel, and Laura had a cut on her cheek, but they were all still alive, barely. "Clint," Sarah's voice crackled through the radio, low and urgent, "we need to find somewhere to lay low. We can't keep running without knowing who's chasing us." Clint shot her a glance. "I know. We're heading to the safe house now. Stay sharp." The safe house was located on the opposite side of the island, nestled in the hills away from the main towns. It was an old, abandoned building Clint had secured months ago, a place where they could regroup and plan without the constant threat of surveillance. But now, even as he sped toward safety, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just running from Moreau, they were running from something far bigger. The warning Moreau had given him echoed in his mind, "You have no idea what you're up against." When they arrived at the safe house, Clint immediately took charge, ushering everyone inside and locking the door behind them. The building was empty, the rooms echoing with the sounds of their hurried footsteps as they moved through it. Clint set up a perimeter, making sure all the windows were covered. He knew this place wasn't impervious to a raid, it was only a temporary solution, but it would have to do for now. "We need to figure out who was behind that attack," Clint said as he moved to the small kitchen, grabbing a bottle of water. His mind was still reeling. The explosion, the ambush, it was all connected to something much larger than just Moreau. That wasn't a simple escape attempt. "Someone knew we were coming." Sarah nodded, setting her gear down on the table. "We've got a big problem. Moreau might be the middleman, but the people pulling the strings are much more dangerous. We need intel, and we need it fast." Victor, his arm still bleeding, limped over to the corner of the room. "You don't think Moreau's the big guy behind all of this, do you?" He was scared, Clint. "There's someone else." Clint looked at Victor, his brow furrowed. "I don't think he's the top of the chain, but that doesn't change the fact that he's in the middle of it. And whoever's running the show is pulling the strings from the shadows. The question is, who?" Laura, still looking a bit dazed from the blast, walked over to the map they had taken from the compound. She tapped it with her finger, tracing the route Moreau had taken them down to the lower levels of the estate. "We know Moreau has dealings with some major international players, but we haven't been able to track any definitive links to larger organizations. Whoever's behind this isn't afraid of getting their hands dirty." Clint ran his fingers through his hair, frustration evident in his movements. They didn't have much time. They needed answers, but their window of opportunity was shrinking by the minute. "We need to go deeper," Clint muttered. "We've got to find out where Moreau's getting his information, who's working with him. He's just a piece of the puzzle." Sarah crossed her arms. "And we need to make sure no one's watching us. This safe house isn't secure for long. If we're going to do this, we need to stay off the radar." As they settled in for the night, Clint's thoughts kept drifting back to the woman at Moreau's estate. She had known too much, and yet, she had said so little. There was something about her, something off. He needed to know more about her. But for now, that would have to wait. He needed to get their team back on track and figure out what came next. The hours passed slowly. They patched up Victor's arm, checked their weapons, and tried to catch their breath. The safe house, while safe for now, felt like a ticking time bomb. They couldn't afford to stay here long. But as Clint sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the flickering screen of his laptop, an idea began to form in his mind. They needed intel on the people backing Moreau. And there was one person who might know everything. The next morning, Clint gathered the team together and laid out a new plan. "We're going to make a visit to an old contact of mine," he began, pacing in front of them. "Her name's Olivia Monroe. She's been in the game for years. She knows the underworld better than anyone. If there's anyone who can give us information on who's behind all this, it's her. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Olivia Munro? I thought she disappeared years ago. No one's heard from her in ages. Clint nodded grimly. That's what she wants everyone to think. But she's alive. And she's been hiding out in Cuba. We're going to need to take a detour. The team exchanged looks, unsure of what this would mean for the mission. Cuba was a far cry from the Cayman Islands, and getting in and out undetected would be no easy feat, but Clint wasn't one to shy away from difficult situations. We need answers, Clint continued. Olivia Munro is the key to figuring out who's really behind all this. We're leaving now. The trip to Cuba was anything but smooth. Clint and his team boarded a small private jet, their destination set for Havana. They knew the risks, but it was a risk they had to take. Olivia Munro was the missing piece, the one person who might hold the key to unraveling the conspiracy that had ensnared them all. The flight was tense. Clint's mind never stopped running through the possibilities. What would Olivia say? Would she help them? Or would she be just another obstacle to overcome? By the time they landed in Havana, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the city's skyline. The team quickly disembarked, keeping their movements low profile as they made their way through the streets. They weren't sure what to expect, but one thing was certain, things were about to get a whole lot more complicated. The humidity in Havana was suffocating, thick in the air as Clint and his team made their way through the bustling streets. The colorful buildings of old Havana loomed around them, their paint peeling from years of neglect, yet they still managed to exude a sort of faded beauty. Clint had always liked this city, its rough edges and vibrant chaos. It was a place where the unexpected could always happen, and he had a feeling he was about to find out just how true that was. The team moved quickly, staying off the main roads to avoid drawing attention. Cuba wasn't exactly the safest place for people like them, especially with the way their mission had escalated. There was no telling who might be watching. We've got eyes on us, Sarah murmured as they walked through an alleyway, her sharp gaze scanning the crowd. Someone's tailing us. Clint nodded, his expression grim. He had suspected as much. If they were being watched, it meant they weren't the only ones interested in Olivia Munro. It also meant that whoever was behind the conspiracy had a far-reaching influence. No one had seen this coming. We'll lose them soon, Clint said, his voice low. Stick to the plan. We find Olivia, we get the intel, and we get out. No unnecessary detours. Olivia Munro wasn't a name that could be found in any public record. She'd been a ghost for years, a legend among people who dealt in shadows. Clint had first met her on a mission a decade ago, back when he was just starting out in the business. Olivia had been sharp, calculating, and unafraid to operate in the gray areas. She had a reputation for getting things done, no matter the cost. But the last time Clint had heard from her, she had vanished without a trace. That was the way she operated, always slipping through the cracks. But Clint knew that if anyone knew who was behind the conspiracy, it would be Olivia. She had deep connections, and her network stretched all the way through Latin America. They finally arrived at a rundown building tucked away in a corner of the city, far from prying eyes. It wasn't much to look at, but Clint knew better than to judge a book by its cover. This was where Olivia had operated out of for years. A place for those who preferred to keep their dealings off the grid. The door creaked open with a soft groan as Clint knocked, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. Sarah stood watch while Clint stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, and the air inside smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. A figure moved from the shadows, a tall woman with dark, sharply cut hair. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and immediately fixed on Clint. Well, if it isn't Clint Eastwood, Olivia Munro said, her voice smooth and steady. I thought you were dead by now. Clint allowed himself a small smile. You've always had a way with words, Olivia. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. You know better than anyone that people like us don't get to fade into the background. What brings you to my little corner of the world? Clint didn't waste time on pleasantries. I need your help, he said, his voice low. We're in over our heads, and we need to know who's really behind the operation Moreau was working for. Olivia's eyes narrowed. You think I'm just going to hand you that kind of information? You've been off the grid too long, Clint. Things have changed since we last spoke. Clint took a step forward, lowering his voice. I'm not asking for favors. This isn't just another mission. People's lives are at stake. I'm asking for your help because I know you know more than anyone else. Olivia studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. You've always been persistent. Fine, she said, after a long pause. I'll tell you what I know. But you'll owe me, Clint. And I don't do favors for free. Clint exhaled slowly. I'm not in a position to negotiate. Olivia turned toward the back of the room, moving to a table cluttered with old files and electronics. She grabbed a folder and tossed it toward Clint. It landed with a thud in front of him. Moreau's not the one pulling the strings, Olivia said, her voice cutting through the silence. He's a pawn. The people behind him, they're part of something much bigger. An organization that's been operating in the shadows for decades. Clint flipped through the file, scanning the contents. The pages were filled with names, locations, and cryptic references to international networks, but nothing concrete. Who are they? He asked, his voice sharp with urgency. Olivia hesitated for a moment before speaking again. They go by many names. The Collective, the Syndicate, even the Cabal. But they're all part of the same thing, an international network that controls everything from arms deals to human trafficking. They pull the strings of governments, corporations, and criminal organizations. Moreau was just a middleman. A cog in the wheel. Clint absorbed her words in silence. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of information. The Syndicate? The Cabal? He'd heard rumors about such organizations, but this was the first time he had concrete proof that something like this actually existed. And now, they were at the center of it. How do we take them down? Clint asked, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. How do we stop them? Olivia looked at him with an expression that was both calculating and weary. You can't take them down without going to the very top. But I've got a lead. One of their higher-ups is operating out of a private island just off the coast of Puerto Rico. You go there, you'll find the person who can tell you everything you need to know. Clint closed the folder and met Olivia's gaze. We'll need more than just a name. We need a plan. Olivia gave him a wry smile. You're not the only one who's been working on plans. But let's be clear, Clint, this is no small operation. You're about to cross a line you can never uncross. Once you go after them, there's no turning back. Clint didn't hesitate. I've never been afraid of crossing lines. As Clint and his team gathered their things and prepared to leave, Olivia's voice stopped him at the door. Be careful, Clint, she called after him. You're playing with fire now. You won't just be fighting criminals, you'll be up against the people who control everything. And they won't hesitate to burn you. Clint turned back to look at her, his face hard with resolve. I'll take my chances. The team boarded their vehicle and began the long drive toward the coast. The information Olivia had given them was a game changer, but it also raised more questions than it answered. Who was the person on the island? What role did they play in the conspiracy? And how far would Clint have to go to stop the syndicate? But one thing was clear, they were no longer just hunting criminals. They were up against a powerful, invisible force, a shadowy network that had its hands in everything. And Clint wasn't going to stop until he brought them down, no matter the cost. The heat of the Cuban sun still clung to Clint's skin as they made their way toward the coast. The dust from the road had settled into his clothes, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the next part of their mission. They had a name, an island, and a plan, but Clint knew better than to believe that this would be easy. If it were, it wouldn't be worth anything. "We're about an hour out," Sarah said, glancing at the GPS screen on her tablet. "We'll be there soon. We should be prepared for anything." Clint didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes were locked on the road ahead, calculating the risks. Everything felt like it was coming to a head. They were about to enter the heart of the syndicate's operations, and this island was their first real chance to strike a blow. But there were so many unknowns. Who exactly would they find there? Was the person they were after truly the puppet master they needed to find, or just another dead end? How do we even know this island is going to have what we need? Laura asked from the back seat, breaking Clint from his thoughts. This could be another trap. Clint turned to look at her, meeting her eyes through the rearview mirror. It's not about knowing. It's about taking a chance. We don't have a choice. Victor, who had been silent since they left Havana, now spoke up. Clint's right. We're not going to find answers if we don't take risks. The syndicate won't stop until they've buried us. We have to fight back. Clint could feel the weight of the words. The more he heard about the syndicate, the more it sounded like they were dealing with an unstoppable force. Still, he refused to back down. If he was going to take them down, he had to go all in. When they arrived at the dock, the sun was low on the horizon, casting an eerie orange glow across the water. The island loomed in the distance, jagged cliffs rising sharply from the sea. It was a place designed to be isolated, far from prying eyes, the perfect hideout for someone trying to escape the world. Clint could feel the tension in the air as they boarded the small boat that would take them to the island. "No turning back now," Clint muttered, as the engine of the boat roared to life. They sailed across the water in near silence, the only sound being the hum of the engine and the splash of the waves against the hull. Sarah was scanning the horizon, eyes sharp for any sign of danger. Laura and Victor were watching their six, each of them alert. Clint was at the helm, his hands steady on the wheel but his mind racing with possibilities. The island seemed to grow larger as they approached, the cliffs casting long shadows across the rocky shore. It looked like an impenetrable fortress, isolated from the rest of the world, but Clint knew better than to be intimidated. This was just another challenge. Another step in taking down the syndicate. As the boat neared the shore, Clint could see the outline of a building perched on the edge of the cliff, a mansion, though it was more like a fortress than a home. It had a sleek, modern design, with heavy steel doors and windows, and it was surrounded by dense trees that seemed to obscure any clear view of the structure. The closer they got, the more Clint's instincts screamed that they were walking into something much darker than they had anticipated. "We're here," Clint said, slowing the boat and steering it toward a narrow cove. "Everyone stay alert." They anchored the boat in the shadows of the cliffs and began to make their way toward the shore. Clint's heart was pounding, every step forward heightening the tension that had been building inside him since they first left Cuba. The team was tight, moving quickly and efficiently, but Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they made their way through the trees toward the mansion, Clint's hand instinctively went to the holster at his side. He knew there was a good chance that this mission would get bloody. He wasn't expecting to find answers without a fight. "Keep low," Clint whispered, as they reached the edge of the trees. He motioned for Sarah to scout ahead. Sarah moved with precision, her figure disappearing into the shadows before Clint could say another word. The rest of the team followed, their movements swift and silent. They reached the mansion's outer walls without incident, and Clint signaled for them to halt. "We're in position," Clint said, his voice barely a whisper. "Sarah, check the perimeter." After a few moments, Sarah's voice crackled over the comms. "The coast is clear, but there are guards. A lot of them. This place is well guarded." Clint's lips pressed into a tight line. Of course it was. They weren't walking into a simple hideout. This was a major operation. He knew that infiltrating the mansion would require all the stealth and precision they had. The team crept closer, blending into the shadows as they approached the back entrance of the mansion. Clint's mind raced, trying to predict what was waiting for them inside. Olivia's lead had been solid, there was no doubt about that, but the complexity of the situation was starting to sink in. They weren't just dealing with criminals anymore, they were up against an organized network with power and resources beyond anything Clint had ever faced before. They reached the back door, and Clint gestured for Sarah to take the lead. She quickly picked the lock, and the door creaked open. They entered the mansion cautiously, Clint's hand on his weapon, ready for anything. The inside of the mansion was sleek and modern, with dark wood floors and polished marble walls. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, and the silence was oppressive. It felt like they were intruding on something much larger than a simple hideout, it felt like a throne room, where someone who controlled everything was sitting at the top. They moved deeper into the mansion, checking every room, every hallway. They hadn't encountered anyone yet, but Clint knew it was only a matter of time. He didn't like how quiet it was. In a place like this, silence could be just as dangerous as gunfire. "We're getting close," Clint murmured as they approached a set of stairs leading down into the basement. The faint sound of voices could be heard from below. "Careful," Sarah warned, her voice low. "We don't know what we're walking into down there." Clint nodded. "We're going in. No matter what." They descended the stairs quietly, the faint glow of lights growing brighter as they neared the bottom. What they found when they reached the final landing took them all by surprise. A high-tech control center. Monitors lined the walls, displaying maps, encrypted communications, and intelligence reports. There was a desk in the center of the room, and sitting behind it was a man Clint had never seen before, but one who exuded power. He didn't even look up when they entered, as if he was waiting for them. Well, the man said, his voice smooth and confident. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Clint." Clint's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The person behind it all. But what came next was the last thing Clint expected. Clint froze for a moment, studying the man in front of him. He was sitting casually behind a sleek desk, his fingers steepled together as if he had been waiting for their arrival. The way he spoke was confident, almost like he was toying with them, and Clint knew right away that this man wasn't just a figurehead in the syndicate, he was the one pulling the strings. "Do you know who I am, Clint?" The man's voice was smooth and cold, but there was a hint of amusement in it as if this was some game he was enjoying far too much. Clint's hand went instinctively to the grip of his pistol, but he didn't draw it just yet. His eyes scanned the room, noting the high-tech monitors, the encrypted communication systems, and the faint hum of machinery. Whoever this was, he was no ordinary criminal mastermind. He was an architect of chaos, a man who had built his empire on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and blood. "I know enough," Clint replied, his voice steady. "I know you're the one running the show. The syndicate. The cabal. All of it. So what happens now?" The man's lips curled into a smirk. "What happens now?" He leaned back in his chair, glancing over at the team behind Clint. "What happens now is that you've walked into my world, Clint. You think you've come to stop me? To end it all? I'm afraid you've miscalculated." Clint didn't flinch. "You're not the first person to think that." The man laughed, a dry, mirthless sound that echoed in the cold, sterile room. "Oh, but I am different. You've been chasing ghosts, Clint. The syndicate isn't one organization, one entity. It's a network. A network of powerful people, corporations, governments. You've been hunting the wrong people this whole time." Clint's eyes narrowed. "Then who are you?" The man tilted his head, his eyes glinting with a cold intelligence. "My name is Dominic Santoro. And I'm not just another criminal. I am a facilitator. I give the people in power what they want. I give them control. I give them influence. And in return, I get to sit at the top. Clint felt his pulse quicken. Santoro wasn't just a criminal mastermind, he was a player in a much larger game, one that Clint had barely begun to understand. You're a middleman, Clint said, his voice low. You supply power to the people who already have it. Santoro's eyes flashed with approval. Exactly. People like you, Clint, you think in terms of good and evil, black and white. But the world doesn't work that way. The people who truly run things, they don't care about right or wrong. They care about what's efficient, what's profitable, and what gives them power. Clint's hand tightened on his gun, but he kept his cool. He wasn't about to give Santoro the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. And what do you get out of it? A comfortable chair in a cold room? Santoro leaned forward, his eyes locking with Clint's. I get to pull the strings. I get to control the game. And now, Clint, you're part of the game. Clint's mind raced. This was bigger than anything he had imagined. Santoro wasn't just a criminal. He was an architect of the very systems that kept the world in chaos. The syndicate wasn't a group of criminals working in the shadows, it was a part of the fabric of the world itself. How many people are involved in this? Clint asked, his voice hoarse. How far does it go? Santoro smiled, a dark, knowing smile. It goes all the way to the top. You think you're going to expose me, Clint? You think you're going to bring down the syndicate? You're already too late. We've been in control for decades. Every government, every major corporation, at some level, we own them. And as for you and your little team, Santoro's eyes flicked to Sarah, Laura, and Victor. You're nothing but pawns. Disposable. Clint took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Then why haven't you just killed us already? Santoro raised an eyebrow. Oh, I'm not going to kill you, Clint. Not yet. You're far more valuable alive. Valuable for what? Clint demanded. You think you can turn us into your puppets? Santoro's smile grew wider. No, Clint. I don't want you as my puppets. I want you as my allies. Clint shook his head, his mind working furiously. You think we're going to join you? After everything you've done? Not join me, Santoro corrected, his voice still calm. But imagine, Clint, what you could do if you worked with me. You could be part of something bigger than anything you've ever imagined. You could have influence, power, anything you wanted. I'm offering you a seat at the table. You and your team. It's the only way you'll survive. Clint's jaw clenched. The offer was tempting, in a way. After everything he had been through, the idea of power, of influence, was not an unfamiliar one. But he wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what Santoro was doing, he was trying to manipulate them into submission. Trying to convince them that joining the syndicate was the only way out. I'd rather die than work for people like you, Clint said, his voice steely. Santoro's smile faltered for just a second, then returned, colder than before. So be it. You'll regret this, Clint. But make no mistake, we're not done. I will be watching you. And you won't get far. No one can escape the syndicate. Clint's fingers brushed the grip of his gun, and for a moment, he considered ending it right there. But then he remembered why he had come. His mission wasn't just to stop Santoro. It was to bring down the entire system, the network that he had helped build. We'll see about that, Clint said, turning on his heel. Let's go. The team moved swiftly, exiting the room with all the precision they'd trained for. Santoro's words echoed in Clint's mind, but he didn't let them distract him. They had a mission to finish, and they were not going to let Santoro or anyone else stop them. As they moved through the mansion, Clint's mind was already racing ahead, thinking of their next move. Santoro might have played his hand, but Clint wasn't finished. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Back at the boat, as they made their way back to the shore, Clint looked at his team. Their faces were set with determination, and Clint could see the same resolve in their eyes. "We're not done yet," Clint said, his voice firm. "This is just one piece of the puzzle. We take down Santoro, and then we go after the rest. No one is safe." Clint's hands gripped the edge of the boat, his knuckles white from the tension. The evening sky had darkened, and the oppressive silence of the sea seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The island had faded into the distance, but the mission wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the boat churned through the water, Clint's mind replayed the events that had just transpired. Dominic Santoro had laid it all out, the grand illusion that the syndicate was untouchable, that its reach stretched into every corner of the world. Santoro had believed that he had them cornered, that he could manipulate them into submission. But Clint wasn't one to back down when the stakes were this high. His team was still shaken, but Clint knew they'd pull through. They always did. "Clint," Sarah's voice interrupted his thoughts. "What now?" Clint glanced over his shoulder, meeting her gaze. Her face was calm, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that betrayed her readiness for whatever came next. "We hit them where it hurts," Clint replied, his voice low and steady. "Santoro might think we're pawns, but he's wrong. He just handed us the blueprint to his empire, and now it's time to tear it down." Victor, who had been quiet for most of the ride, spoke up. "You're talking about going after the top dogs, right? The ones pulling the strings from behind the scenes?" Clint nodded. "Exactly. Santoro's just the middleman. We take him down, but we make sure the entire system comes crashing down with him. We expose the syndicate for what it is, a house of cards. And when it falls, there won't be anyone left to pick up the pieces." Laura shifted uncomfortably. "But the syndicate's everywhere. Even if we take down Santoro, we won't be able to dismantle the entire network. They have people everywhere, Clint. We'll be fighting an endless war." Clint met her gaze and held it. "Maybe. But if we don't do this, then nothing changes. We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everyone who's been crushed under the syndicate's thumb. And we'll fight until we've taken them all down." Sarah, who had been silently contemplating Clint's words, finally spoke up. "We need to expose Santoro's connections. The people he works with. His allies in the shadows. If we can make those connections public, it'll start a chain reaction. People will turn on him. People will fight back." Clint smiled, the plan starting to take shape. "Exactly. We hit them where it hurts, right in the heart of their operations. We gather the intel we need, then we release it to the world. The power of the people will be the final blow." Victor grinned. "You're talking about a revolution, huh?" Clint's eyes narrowed with resolve. "A revolution that starts right here. We've been chasing shadows for far too long, but now we have the truth. And when people know the truth, they can't ignore it. We're going to make sure of that." The rest of the boat ride was spent in silence as they made their way back to the mainland. Clint could feel the weight of the task ahead pressing on him. There was no turning back now. They had a plan, and they had a target. It was just a matter of executing it. By the time they docked and returned to their safe house, the first light of dawn was breaking. They hadn't slept in hours, but Clint wasn't tired. Not yet. He gathered his team around the table, the map of their next move spread out before them. "We've got work to do," Clint said, his voice calm but firm. "This is our moment. We get in, gather everything we need, and then we burn the syndicate to the ground. If we do this right, Santoro and everyone else who's been pulling the strings will have nowhere to hide." The days that followed were a blur of action. Clint and his team infiltrated safe houses, gathered intelligence, and made contact with anyone they could trust. Every move they made was carefully calculated, every decision weighed with the consequences. The information they were collecting was invaluable. Santoro might have thought he was untouchable, but the truth was far more dangerous to him than he realized. But Clint wasn't done yet. The final step of their plan wasn't just to expose Santoro's operations, it was to dismantle them from the inside out. The night before the final strike, Clint stood alone on the balcony of their safe house, staring out over the city. The weight of everything that had led to this point, the betrayal, the manipulation, the lies, was pressing down on him. He thought of the people he had lost, the lives ruined by the syndicate's grip on power. He had made a promise to them. And now, it was time to make good on that promise. Clint. Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see her standing behind him. "We're ready. You know this is it, right?" Clint nodded. "I know. Tomorrow, we make our move. This ends now." The next day, they struck. The operation was swift, precise. Clint's team worked in tandem, infiltrating key locations across the syndicate's network. They didn't just attack one person, they attacked the entire infrastructure. Every file, every communication, every piece of evidence was gathered, compiled, and made public. It was a slow burn at first, but then it erupted into chaos. News outlets across the globe began to pick up the story. The syndicate's dirty secrets were spilled out for the world to see. Santoro's connections to corrupt politicians, criminal organizations, and international corporations were exposed in a blaze of headlines. And it didn't stop there. As the world reacted, the syndicate began to crumble. Key players started turning on each other, and factions that had once stood united began to splinter. Power structures that had taken decades to build were dismantled in a matter of days. Clint and his team watched as the world they had been fighting to change began to shift before their eyes. But they weren't finished. Clint stood before a screen, watching as the final pieces of the syndicate's empire fell apart. The last of the files were being released to the public, and the world was waking up to the truth. Santoro's network was exposed, and the people who had been complicit in the syndicate's reign of terror were now exposed as well. "It's over," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. Clint didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure if it was truly over yet. But as he looked at his team, standing strong beside him, he realized something. They had done it. They had torn down the syndicate. And in doing so, they had changed the world. No more shadows. No more lies. Just the truth. And for the first time in a long time, Clint allowed himself a breath of relief. "We've won," Clint said softly, his voice steady but filled with a quiet triumph. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?